What do you think of the state of our politics today in Britain?
It's terrible.
Hello everyone, it's Saturday the 25th of July and I'm in the southwest London parliamentary constituency of Putney. At the last general election, the Labour Party under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn lost 60 seats, but did manage to gain one, and that was this one right here. I'm here today because I want to talk to locals about that election, Labour's performance in it, and whether or not they think Keir Starmer is an improvement on Jeremy Corbyn as Labour leader. Which party did you vote for at the last general election and why?
I actually voted Tory because I began to think whatever we thought about Brexit, we now had to do it. So I voted Tory.
So I voted for Labour. My knowledge isn't actually fantastic with politics. I should know more as a younger person, I think. But I voted for Labour partly because it's better to vote than not vote, and I think I, as much as anyone else, kind of deserve their voice, and I'd rather have a say than not, basically.
I voted for the Conservative Party because I was in favour of Brexit, and I didn't think Labour would deliver.
I mean, really, I was going to do Labour myself, and then they kept coming around, and then I was a bit confused, really, so I just them Conservative.
What were you confused about?
I don't know, everybody coming to the door telling us different things. And I live in a sheltered accommodation for the elderly, telling us different things.
What were the different things that they were telling you? I assume you're talking about canvassers for the Labour Party.
Yeah, different things coming through the letterbox. I was getting a bit confused, but I just thought I'll do what I want to do. And I just done Conservative.
Did you feel they were talking down to you?
Yes, definitely, yeah.
But why Labour over the other parties?
Well, I think when it came to it, and I know I got kind of leaflets through the door from Labour, and they were definitely showing up in force at the train station and things. I didn't see anything from other parties, Conservative or anything like that.
That made a difference, the local campaigning?
I think so.
I voted Conservative, and I think primarily it was a protest vote against Jeremy Corbyn. It wasn't specifically to do with local issues or regional issues, but I just felt as a statesman and in taking the UK forwards, Jeremy Corbyn represented too much of a risk in the UK, so it was actually a blocking vote, if you like.
I'm part of like a film kind of industry background, and I seem to remember some of their kind of stances with and their kind of policies with Brexit and their kind of movement with that kind of supported my industry and kind of keeping ties with other countries and decent and being able to go and film in other countries, and for me that opens up more benefits in terms of my career.
It should also be mentioned that this constituency, Putney, is estimated to have voted 72% in favour of Remain in the 2016 EU referendum.
I think the European Union has done a lot of damage to this country. The supply of cheap labour has prevented us from investing in industry, and we are losing our culture as a result of mass immigration.
I felt economically we probably shouldn't have left the European Union and for the future of our young people. However, it was a democratic vote, and the majority voted to leave, and therefore we had to leave.
When you say we're losing our culture, can you just explain that a little bit?
The traditional English approach to life has been altered quite a lot, I think, by cultures that don't necessarily follow the same sort of rules, traditions as we have here. I mean, this is not, this is going to sound like an absolute cliche. This is not a racist view. It's just a matter of, I think there should be some purity of culture within nations. Look at Japan. Japan has maintained its culture, maintained its history. Look at Britain, and we are talking about tearing down statues that represent historic heroes, basically. So we are losing our culture in this country. Not to be too flippant, but people don't queue in the same way any longer.
The seat of Putney was held by the Conservatives from its creation in 1918 until 1964, despite Labour winning general elections in both 1945 and 1950. It was 1964 when Labour won the seat for the first time, and they held on to it until the 1979 general election when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister. From that point, the Conservatives held on to it for 18 years until the 1997 general election, when they lost it to Labour again as Tony Blair became Prime Minister. After the seat went to the Conservatives once more in 2005, Labour managed to win it back yet again last year. Why do you think the Labour Party lost at the last general election in the manner they did?
Unfortunately, I think it comes back to Corbyn. I think on pure policy grounds, it would have been a much closer run competition. But I think the leader's so important because he sets the agenda, he describes the vision, he sets a roadmap, and ultimately people have to come to somebody for a decision. And you really need to be able to trust that decision maker. And if you don't have that inherent feeling that, okay, he may make mistakes because everybody makes mistakes, but is he generally going to try and do the right thing, then I don't think you back that individual.
Sadly, I think Jeremy Corbyn was just too left-wing. So I'm not sure it was necessarily about Brexit. I think it was against Jeremy Corbyn.
When you say he was too left-wing, could you elaborate on that?
Okay, some of his ideas weren't even appealing to the people who vote Labour, and he was, and he's had a history. To be fair to Jeremy Corbyn, he's always been the same person. He didn't change because he was leader of the party, but basically, the Labour votes like the armed forces. They like the idea of defence spending, and and also the fact that he was anti-Brexit, and a lot of Labour voters did vote Brexit. So Brexit definitely had something to do with the last election.
I don't think he's a bad person. I think he's well-intentioned, and I think I'm sure he's done good work in the past. But if you look at some of his associations throughout history, they're questionable, to say the least. I think he's been quite close to the provisional movement in Northern Ireland. He's been quite close to some Middle Eastern groups who are pretty unsavoury. And he represents a side of the Labour Party that I think has some more extreme views than the majority of the public would want.
Why do you think Labour lost the last general election in the manner they did?
First of all, they ignored the democratic result of Brexit. Secondly, I think the leadership came up with a manifesto that was far too radical, unrealistic, and didn't actually represent what you might call the average working class person is actually interested in. Essentially, Labour had become a metropolitan bubble. So they were just representing the views of people who thought like they thought. So they weren't actually representing the more general view of the British public.
Putney was the only seat Labour managed to gain at the last general election. Why do you think that this seat here was the only one to fall into that category?
As I said, I think it's just because we have a very diverse community and lots and lots of young people. And, and I was delighted Labour won, even having voted Tory. I didn't want Labour to lose so badly because we need a strong opposition. So I think it's because of that.
Brexit probably had something to do with it. I'm sure it was a factor. But then I would also say, in fairness, that Labour did change their position on Brexit during the campaign a couple of times, to the extent that they didn't make the position clear enough. And in that way, I'm a little bit surprised that Labour won out. If they'd had a very clear position on Brexit and they had stuck to it, they probably would have had a bigger win. But they won, and that's where we are now.
Did you grow up here?
No, so I used to live in Lewisham when I was much, much younger, and then I moved to Tunbridge Wells in Kent. So that's where I grew up, and that's very conservative.
How long have you lived in Putney?
I've lived here 2 years now.
And do you think that there are more young people living here than when you started living here?
No, not necessarily. I think 2 years is a short amount of time, but I feel like it's over the past sort of 5 years. I do think a lot. It's become almost like Clapham, this kind of trendy place. I think Battersea kind of area is becoming like that as well, and young people are starting to kind of flock there.
Putney's become that way.
Yeah, I think so.
Putney is a middle class, slightly hypocritical area, and so they want Brexit. I mean, they don't want Brexit. I'm sorry, I rephrase that. They want it to remain, and so I think Labour did well here purely because of the Remain vote. I'm quite sure in a couple of years' time these people who voted Labour will revert back to their native political party, and they'll start voting Liberal and Conservative.
I used to vote Labour when I myself was young, but the last few years I've been going more and more Tory, I'm afraid to say.
So that's quite interesting. Can you talk about that? Can you talk about that process? How you go from a young Labour supporter to an older Tory supporter?
I think when you're young, you do really care about the most vulnerable in society, and you really absolutely believe that everybody should be equal. Then life gets on. I believe in a socialist system, and which we basically are. We are a socialist country. I've lived in countries abroad where the poor absolutely get nothing from the government, and that is terrible. However, it's not quite as simple as just let's tax the rich to help the poor. We've got to look after our manufacturing industries. We've got to look after industry, which makes the money for social services. So I think that's the reason I changed.
This is a middle class, very affluent area, very monocultural. Not an awful lot of people live here who are not white, and yet they espouse all of the liberal views of multiculturalism, and that's what I mean by hypocritical. They live in £1.5 million houses and have posters on the windows saying we support the National Health Service and we support low-paid workers. Same people who 2 months ago or 2 months before lockdown would not have interrupted a mobile telephone conversation to say thank you to the person working in the supermarket, and yet they are all in favour now. It's politically correct to be in favour of low-paid workers, but they're hypocrites, I'm afraid.
I think a lot of politics has become very partisan. The metaphor I quite like is it's become a Punch and Judy show, and it's much more about knocking each other. One person takes a stance, the other person takes the opposite stance. Well, in actual case, it's not normally a right and a wrong thing to do. There's a best course of action, irrespective of your political party, and you shouldn't tie yourself to a point of view just because it's the opposite to the one that you're challenging. That's not. You wouldn't go through life just necessarily disagreeing with everything that happens in a family or in a work situation, for instance. So why should you in a political situation?
The old joke: what is a liberal? A conservative who hasn't been mugged. And I think every single person here, once they are a victim of some kind of crime, will revert back to their normal politics, liberal and conservative.
What do you think of the state of our politics today in Britain?
It's terrible.
Why do you think that?
Well, they're not doing enough, I don't think. I mean, like, different things need doing, like us elderly people, that not doing enough for us. You're putting the television licence back to us, I'm 84, and they're putting it back to us, so there's so many things, good things they do as well, so what can I say? Not a lot really, but I mean we're there if they help, if we need them.
There has become a political elite that I think is quite well known, where people have come from good education, shall we say, and gone into political advisor roles, and that's led to MPs positions and climbing up the political hierarchy without necessarily the exposure to the real world of business and all the struggles that families and individuals have to deal with. It is challenging these days. It's hard, particularly in the coronavirus era. I would like to see people who in politics who bring a greater depth to the role. They can speak from experience when they're working as leaders of departments and ministers and these things.
Do you think Keir Starmer is an improvement on Jeremy Corbyn as Labour leader?
Absolutely. I'm afraid to say yes, and I actually think he'll be a serious contender the next election to be Prime Minister.
He's an improvement as regards the public face, but I think he is just as unreliable as Jeremy Corbyn. I don't actually think Keir Starmer has any political ideas whatsoever. He just follows whatever he thinks is going to get him popularity. I don't think he has any principles whatsoever.
I haven't spent a long time studying what he says. His background, to my earlier point, seems pretty credible as a lawyer and barrister, I believe. He seems to adopt, from what I've seen, a pretty analytical approach to problems, so it's not based on subjective points of view, stances that have been adopted in the past, that type of thing. He seems to be quite rational, and he does seem to represent a good challenge to the Prime Minister at question time and in those various issues, which is absolutely needed and important. And I get the feeling that he's actually settled in a lot better and done a lot better than people probably anticipated. So yeah, he does come across as a big improvement.
He's just 100% improvement, and he's more centralist, and I think a lot of Labour voters are not as left-wing as Jeremy Corbyn. And then they're more, that's why Tony Blair, I think, was so incredibly popular. And I think that's who he appeals to.
Boris Johnson's quite right in constantly accusing him of being a lawyer. And that's exactly what he is. Whoever pays him, that's the case he will argue. So I don't think Keir Starmer is an improvement on Jeremy Corbyn. I don't think he's going to convince working class voters that Labour is now a working class party. In fact, I think he might reinforce the impression that Labour is actually a party for the middle classes and is not a party for the average working person.
Do you think Keir Starmer is an improvement on Jeremy Corbyn as Labour leader?
I wouldn't know. I don't know. I'm not aware. Is he now the leader? I don't know. I wouldn't be able to answer that question just because I'm not well versed in that.
You're not a political boffin.
No, not at all.
Fair enough. Right, everyone. I have approached more than 200 members of the public here in Putney today to try to get them to agree to an interview, and so far I've managed to secure an interview with just one Labour voter at the last general election. I wish I could have got interviews with more, but it's raining, I'm soaking wet, I've been here for more than 7 hours, I'm very tired, and I think I'm going to go home. So thank you very much, and please make sure you subscribe to this channel.